Oh, that's fine. अभी भी गिर रहा है. अच्छा नहीं ठीक हो. Justice Rohinton Nariman, Justice Ramasubramanian, Justice Madan Lokur, and all of you watching safely from home. Welcome to the Justice Sunanda Bhandare Foundation's 26th Memorial Lecture. Each one of our lectures has been unique and has contributed to civil society's awareness of gender rights and the gap that needs to be bridged. But when we look back at this one, we will remember also the unprecedented times in which it was held. Due to the surge in COVID numbers and in the midst of a new wave, we have decided to hold our memorial lecture virtually for the first time. In many ways, Justice Nariman's willingness to adapt is not only a triumph of technology, but of the human will to change and overcome the odds. It is exactly this spirit we need to fight the pandemic and also the deeply embedded patriarchy in our society. We will triumph. So welcome to the Justice Sunanda Bhandare Memorial Lecture, a now permanent feature on our annual calendar since 1995. I would like to take just a brief moment to announce the winners of the 2021 Justice Sunanda Bhandare Award. The award this year goes to Babita Saini of Village B1 in District Noor, Haryana. District Noor was classified by the Niti Aayog as one of India's most backward districts with a literacy rate of just 56.1%. Babita Saini is the first woman graduate and first woman in her village to get employment. After completing her 10th standard, she fought to be allowed to continue with school instead of getting married. The foundation commends her for starting a virtuous cycle of girls' education, not only in her own family, but also in her village where now other girls are enrolled in college. Incidentally, Babita also persuaded her mother, who had studied only till the 8th standard, to clear the 10th board exam through open school. As school shifted to online learning, the gender digital gap shut out large numbers of girls as well as boys, who simply do not have access to smartphones and digital devices. This year's award also goes to the Digital Empowerment Foundation, founded by Osama Manzar in 2002, and has dedicated itself through the pandemic to provide access to online tools to stem the disruption in education. We applaud Digital Empowerment Foundation's crucial role in promoting women web champions, upskilling 10,000 women entrepreneurs from marginalized communities, and strengthening women-led community development organizations. So, without taking up any more of your time, I now invite Justice Madan Lokur, Chairman of our foundation, to introduce Justice Rohinton Nariman.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and ladies and gentlemen, everyone who's here and everyone who's watching on the digital platforms. Well, today is, of course, very unusual in the sense that we are having to do this digitally, but I'm sure all of you are going to enjoy the lecture that Justice Rohinton Nariman will be delivering today. We have with us Justice Ramasubramanian, who also is an expert on Hindu texts and the relevance of Hindu texts to law. So welcome, Justice Ramasubramanian. We have, of course, the distinguished speaker today, Justice Rohinton Nariman. He is very versatile in Western classical music, and he told me at one point of time that if he hadn't been a lawyer, he would have been a conductor. I mean, a music conductor of the Zubin Mehta variety. He has tremendous knowledge and expertise in history, as you will find out today, religion, and, of course, constitutional law. But in addition to that, he has a great sense of humor, and it's always a pleasure to be with him. Today, physically, we will be missing Mr. Murli Bhandare, Baba, as he is very fondly known. At the age of 92, I don't think it's safe for him to have been here physically. But knowing him, I will not be surprised if he suddenly sneaks in from somewhere. He has been, of course, the pillar of strength for all of us over here. And I'm sure he'll be keenly watching these proceedings. So with these few words, may I invite Justice Rohinton Nariman. He'll be speaking to us about great women of history. Justice Nariman.
Thank you, Madan. My dear Murli, pater familias of the Bhandare clan, my brethren on the dais, sister and brother judges, ladies and gentlemen, cherchez la femme is something which is attributed to Voltaire, but is actually to be found in a novel by Alexandre Dumas, père, that is the father. And the novel is called The Mohicans of Paris. It's a pejorative expression, which means fundamentally that you look out for the woman whenever there is trouble, as a source of that trouble. The unfortunate cherchez la femme has its roots way back in ancient history and in religion. If we start with the Bible itself, you will find that Eve was made from Adam's rib. Everyone knows that man is in fact born of woman, but the Bible tells us that short of Adam, every other man was, but then Adam was first. Equally, if you see the Rig Veda and you come across the 10th, the last mandala, chapter 95, verse 15, that again says that do not make lasting friendships with women, for they are like hyenas. A very, very strong statement made quite long ago. The old Persian texts also tell us that the source of menstruation is because there was a primeval whore called Jay. And it's because she chose to be a whore that women were afflicted with menstruation, something like Adam's original sin, however, translated this time into women and menstruation. Now, given this kind of background, and given the fact that even fairly recently, when Jefferson gave us the Declaration of Independence and said all men are created equal, not only did he leave out the blacks, but he left out half of humanity. He did not mean women. So we have had this misogynistic tradition for ages, as a result of which women have had to be like the great Greek orator Demosthenes. Demosthenes was a person who was born a stammerer. So the first thing he had to do was get over the stammer. After which, he wanted to be better than any other orator. So we are told by Plutarch that as a matter of fact, he used to practice by putting pebbles in his mouth so that finally when he spoke, he'd be able to speak without the pebbles and therefore be able to be the greatest orator of his time. Now, exactly like Demosthenes, women in history have all started out by their being perceived by the other sex as something below the male sex, that is, stammerers in Demosthenes' terms. And they have had to put pebbles throughout in order to show that they are better than men in order to perform. And I have chosen for this, as the subject matter of this lecture, 5 such remarkable women. The first remarkable woman is Cleopatra. She goes back 2,000 years. And she was actually the 7th of her dynasty. Now, she is descended from one of the generals of Alexander. And as you know, Alexander's huge empire fragmented into 4 pieces. And the Egyptian part was taken over by Ptolemy I. It was really taken over because it had been a satrap of the Persian Empire. As a matter of fact, the 27th and the 31st dynasties in Egypt were the Achaemenian. The start of the Achaemenian, that is with Cambyses, that is Cyrus the Great's son, and the 31st being Artaxerxes III, and finally Darius III, who got defeated at Issus and Gaugamela by Alexander. So, because of the defeat in Persia, Egypt fell into Alexander's lap, as a result of which Ptolemy, who happened to be present, now became the first pharaoh of the Greek dynasty, Greek/Macedonian dynasty. It is from Ptolemy II that this peculiar Egyptian habit of marrying your sister got into vogue, as a result of which you had a series of all kinds of lunatics and geniuses. Now, Cleopatra was by no means a lunatic. She was a real genius. She could speak something like 4 languages. And she could charm anybody. Shakespeare's great quote in Antony and Cleopatra, "Age cannot wither, nor custom, the infinite variety," is a great quote because it is really a quote which tells you exactly what this woman was. It is, as a point of fact, at a stage where Antony is now to marry Octavia, because Octavian has persevered and is trying to get Antony out of Egypt. And Antony had a dalliance with Cleopatra. So, the two Shakespearean characters are speaking to each other, and one telling the other that now Antony will have to call it quits and go back. So the answer given is this answer, saying, there's no question of going back. Once you are in her coils, you are caught for life. Going back to her youth, she was one out of 6 children of Ptolemy the 12th. He was also called Ptolemy the Auletes. Auletes meant flute because he liked playing the flute. He was obviously a better musician than a ruler, for the reason that he tried to rebel against Rome. Rebellion was put down, and he was taken over to Rome when Sulla was dictator at that point of time. And the little Cleopatra went with him to Rome, as the only child who went to Rome. And it seems he was treated so badly that when Sulla was being administered some laxative, he actually called in Ptolemy and had him dismissed. So she grew up in this tradition of seeing Rome boss over her great country. And finally, when her father died, she and her brother were declared joint rulers, in the old tradition of brother marrying sister and being joint rulers. Now, at that point of time, you had a great triumvirate in Rome after Sulla the dictator died. And the triumvirate consisted of Julius Caesar, Crassus, and the other great general. Now, the great general Pompey had been defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus in 79 BC. And even before that, Crassus had been defeated by the Parthians. Crassus, you'll remember, was a great figure because Crassus had put down the Spartacus revolt, the slave revolt, and was a very wealthy man. So when he himself was put down, the triumvirate now became these two gentlemen, Caesar and Pompey. And Pompey got defeated at Pharsalus and then went to Egypt thinking that he could get asylum there because Ptolemy the 13th had signed it with him. Unfortunately, as soon as he landed, he was murdered. And the moment he was murdered, his head was kept as an offering to Julius Caesar, who was now about to come to Egypt. When Julius Caesar came to Egypt, Plutarch tells us, and this is therefore a true story, that Cleopatra was actually rolled out of a carpet when she was brought to him. And the moment she rolled out of that carpet, the first thing she tried to tell Caesar was that Caesar ought not to trust her brother. Caesar tried to mediate between the two, found it almost impossible. And shortly after, they became lovers. Now, the fruit of their love happened to be a son. actually the only son Julius Caesar ever bore. He was called Caesarion. He was married 3 times, by the way, and he couldn't bear us, and none of his wives were able to bear a son. History tells us about the second wife, that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, if you remember. And that was because Poppaea, who was the second wife, was indulging in some all-women festival, and some man crept in. And as a result of the man creeping in, rumors started flying around saying that she may have had an affair with that man, as a result of which Caesar said, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, and promptly divorced her. One other kudo to the male bastion. And finally, when Caesar settled down with Cleopatra, and the little son got bigger, Caesar decided to take Cleopatra to Rome for a second time. And he paraded her around in Rome. She wasn't very popular. In fact, Cicero, when he met her, thought she was extremely vain. And as a result, Cleopatra was kept in a villa just outside Rome with her little son. 44 BC arrived, the Ides of March came, and Caesar went with the Ides of March. He got murdered. As a result of which, she was advised by Mark Antony at the time to leave Rome. So she left Rome and went back to Egypt. She then ruled in Egypt from 44 BC right up to 31 with Antony, who followed her. As a matter of fact, she produced 3 children from Antony. And she ruled wisely, she ruled well, until, unfortunately, Octavian, who now had become the Emperor Augustus, decided to reclaim Egypt. And finally, after a land battle, the famous Battle of Actium was fought, which was a major sea battle, in which tactically Antony and Cleopatra made a big mistake by dividing up their fleets. And once the fleets were divided, and Antony's fleet told Cleopatra to turn around because Antony thought he was losing. Cleopatra turned around. And because Cleopatra turned around, Antony's fleet, in turn, felt that they had lost the battle when they hadn't. And so went the Battle of Actium. Now, thanks to the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra was then faced with the fact that Egypt would now, her beloved Egypt would now fall into Roman hands yet again. Unfortunately, she tried one last attempt with Antony, but Antony was told that she had killed herself when she hadn't. So he stabbed himself, and the entire thing ended in a huge tragedy with her being bitten by an asp, which is an Egyptian cobra, as a result of which she also died. Shortly after Rome then took over Egypt, her little son got murdered, obviously by the new emperor, Augustus. And the other children, through Antony, were brought up, strangely enough, by Octavian's sister, who was Antony's wife, Octavia. And with this great queen, who did her best to try and save Egypt from being a satrap of Rome, ultimately failed. And failed she did only because, as a woman, she could not possibly rule it and hope to continue to rule it against the male dominance of Rome. The second remarkable character is perhaps the most remarkable of all. The last bastion of male orthodoxy, if I may call it that, is the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I wonder if any of you have heard that in the 9th century, there was supposedly a Pope John. Now, how could there possibly be a Pope John? You didn't have females who could become priests in the first place. However, her legend continued, and chroniclers in the 13th century started telling us that there did exist this lady who was a lady born of English parents in Mainz in Germany. And she proved herself to be so adept at the scriptures having dressed, of course, as a man throughout, nobody knew she was a woman, that she became a cardinal. And having become a cardinal, after Pope Leo IV, who was one of the great popes who fortified the walls of Rome, she was elected by the Roman populace. Now, at that point of time, elections of popes took place by the Roman people. They did not take place by an electoral college consisting of cardinals. That happened only in 1159, much after she existed, when Pope Nicholas II laid it down in a papal bull that from henceforth we will have this electoral college consisting of cardinals who will now select the Pope. And a century later, at the Third Lateran Council, a 2/3 majority had to be obtained before somebody could be invested as Pope. But at her time, and she's supposed to have been in 855 AD, she was elected by the people of Rome. Now, Jean de Mailly, who's one of the chroniclers in the 13th century, tells us that she actually sat on that throne for 2 years, 5 months, and 9 days. How she got discovered is a remarkable story. She was apparently pregnant with child. And from St. Peter's, she started walking towards St. Clement's Church by a small road which is never used by the popes thereafter. And there's apparently a little shrine there which is supposed to house her remains. And on the way, somehow, she was walking uphill, she gave birth to the baby. And when she gave birth to the baby, there's a divergence of what happened to her. The original manuscript says she was stoned on the spot. The other manuscript, which is now in Berlin, says that no, she wasn't. She was sent away to a nunnery, and her son was brought up by the Catholic Church and actually became Bishop of Ostia afterwards. But whatever the story, the Catholic Church staunchly denies that there ever was a female pope. Even I thought that this story was a little far-fetched until I read a beautiful book by a scholar called Peter Stanford. It's a recent book. It's been released in 2000. He marshals all the facts and then gives us 5 reasons as to why this lady actually existed. The first most important reason is the fact that these chroniclers spoke about her and spoke about her reign. And somebody in the 16th century actually collected 500 such chronicles. So there appears to have been this historical figure. Second, this particular narrow lane that was used by her, in which she gave birth to the child, was shunned by every pope thereafter. It's a fact that no pope ever goes down that lane, even though that lane is the shortest point to St. Clement's Church. If they have to go to St. Clement's Church, they take a roundabout way. Third, there were statues erected to her, one in Rome, one in Siena, with child. The one in Rome was outside the Colosseum. And as you know, the Colosseum was constructed by Emperor Vespasian. And it was called the Colosseum because there was a colossus of the Emperor Nero outside it, which didn't exist shortly after. But anyway, somewhere near the Colosseum, there was her statue as well. And Martin Luther, who visited Rome in 1510, tells us that he actually saw that statue. So for a long period, you had in the Middle Ages the statue of this lady. And obviously you couldn't possibly have had it in Rome if the church believed that she did not exist. Most interesting of all, as a matter of fact, is the fact that medieval popes used to be invested on a chair which looked like a commode. Now, apparently Innocent II was invested on that chair. Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, was invested on that chair, until the only Dutch Pope, that is Hadrian VI, decided in the 16th century that this chair will no longer be used. Now, why was that chair used? That chair apparently was where the papal elect sat for the first time before being invested. And the deacon next to him would actually have to put his hand out and feel the testosterone levels of the gentleman, after which he would declare that this is a gentleman and therefore ought to be invested as Pope. Peter Stanford, as a matter of fact, actually went to the Vatican and in some room where a lot of artifacts were just thrown, actually found one of these two chairs. The other was apparently taken away by Napoleon. So putting all this together and piecing all this together, we find that this remarkable lady not only existed, but was a pope who managed to survive for 2 years and 5 months in an all-male setup. Something remarkable. Many other remarkable things also happened in the 9th century. Towards the end of the 9th century, you have what is called the famous cadaver synod. Now, why is it called cadaver? Because there was a pope called Formosus. And Formosus had invested his successor, Stephen VI, with a bishopric. And if at that point of time you were a bishop, you could not possibly stand for election to become pope. Formosus died, and Stephen, as bishop, stood to become pope and got elected. There was a huge clamor saying there's no question, he's faulted at the start, he's a bishop. So what did Stephen VI do? He exhumed the dead body of Formosus, put it on a chair, and actually had a trial. The cadaver was put to trial and finally found guilty, as a result of which 3 of its fingers, which blessed people, were cut off. The body again thrown into a grave and then picked up and then thrown into the river Tiber. And most importantly, from Stephen's point of view, every single papal bull or decree that was made by Formosus was annulled. Now, the moment it was annulled, it meant his bishopric also went, which meant that he became pope and was invested as pope correctly. Stephen, unfortunately, didn't last. He was horribly murdered in 897. And after him, you had 2 other popes who reinvested Formosus, and then finally a Pope, Sergius III, who decided that Formosus must now be banished once and for all and thrown back into the Tiber. Sergius III, in turn, had a remarkable mistress called Marozia. And this lady, in turn, happened to become the mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and great-great-grandmother of 6 popes, starting with Pope John XII. And the last of them, that is the great-great-grandson, turned out to be Benedict IX, who was perhaps the most evil pope in history. He beat the Borgia popes. He was invested at a very young age of 20. And he was removed from the papacy thrice during his reign. The second time, he removed himself because he sold the papacy. Now, it's remarkable that in Rome, there were 2 such sales in history. One was this sale by him to his successor, Gregory VI. And Gregory VI later was told by the cardinals that, look, you did a terrible thing by buying the papacy. And he said, what do you people think I should do? So they told him, why don't you look at your own conscience and judge yourself? So he looked at his own conscience, judged himself, and said, yes, I must step down. The other famous instance in history of a sale taking place is that of the Roman Empire itself. In 193 AD, Pertinax was murdered. He was the Roman emperor. And the Praetorian Guard put up the Roman Empire for sale. A citizen called Julianus Didinanus actually purchased the empire by paying 25,000 sesterces, which was the currency at the time, to each soldier. He ruled for some 66 days before a general, Septimius Severus, came and finally had him beheaded. Now, coming back to this Pope Benedict IX ultimately had the ignominy not only of giving up his popedom 3 times, but actually being excommunicated at the end of it. All this is very interesting. And all this tells us that anything is therefore possible. And anything being possible makes me believe, after reading at least Peter Stanford's book, that Pope Joan was in fact a historical fact. A remarkable woman who, like Demosthenes, overcame a lot and was able to finally sit on the exclusive male preserve of the Middle Ages in those days. We come now to our other great lady, and this time we don't have to travel far. All of you have seen the Qutub Minar. Razia Sultana was the daughter of the emperor Iltutmish. She was a remarkable woman. And Iltutmish, her father, was a remarkable man. They were all members of what was called the slave dynasty. Why? Because they were manumitted slaves. Qutubuddin Aibak, who started the Qutub Minar, was actually a slave who was manumitted by Muhammad of Ghor. And he became Muhammad of Ghor's viceroy here. And once Muhammad of Ghor died, he declared himself king. He died in 1206. And his son-in-law, Iltutmish, succeeded after 1 or 2 inept sons succeeded him. And managed to rule for a fairly long period, till 1236 AD. Iltutmish had a massive empire. Nobody realizes, when one sees his grave, which is a little open grave outside the Qutub complex, that this was the man who completed the Qutub Minar first. What he did was, he built upon Aibak's first story and went right up until you see the last marble part, which was built by Firuz Shah Tughlaq when it was hit by lightning. This remarkable man ruled over an empire which went all the way from Sindh in the west to the entire North India, right up to Kashmir, and east, right up to Bengal. So it was a massive empire. In 1229, he had a terrible setback. The son who he thought would succeed him died. And he's built his tomb, which is Sultan Ghari's tomb, which is a very beautiful tomb which people in Delhi should visit. It is somewhere near Vasant Kunj. And it's a remarkable tomb in that it's a small little round marble-shaped tomb with the actual tomb going down. It's not some massive structure. It only has walls around it. Now, when this son died, Iltutmish decided that all his other sons were useless and actually announced that his daughter will succeed him, something that was unthinkable at that point of time. We are talking about the 13th century. So once he did that, and once he died, one of his sons, Ruknuddin Firoz, declared himself as Firoz Shah I and got onto the throne and managed to stay on it for about 6 months. This fantastic lady, always dressed in male attire, mind you. At this time she was in red. She used to drive, apparently she used to drive around on a pet elephant. She at the Friday prayer said that this man is utterly inept. If he was okay, there'd be no problem. You can see that I am a woman. But if I am more capable than any man, please give me a chance, and I want to prove it. My father thought so. My father invested me with this authority. Why don't you? So the people said yes. And the people threw this man over. She managed to rule for 3 years. And she ruled extremely well. The chronicler of the time said that she was easily the wisest, most capable, and greatest leader of her time, except that she was a woman. And because she was a woman, unfortunately, she got murdered after that short 3-year reign. And the murder took place because she invested great faith in an Abyssinian slave called Yakut. And the Turkish nobles who were in her court got jealous of the fact that they were bypassed in favor of this Yakut. So they had Yakut murdered. Now, she therefore fought against them and ultimately got imprisoned in Bhatinda. There is a fort in Bhatinda which was built by Kanishka. Therefore, it's a 2,000-year-old fort. And the governor of that fort, Malik Altunya, was originally opposed to her, but then somehow or the other came onto her side. And strangely enough, she went and married him. Now, having married him, the two of them then went to reclaim the kingdom. And they fought a battle, lost, and then finally fled to a place called Kaithal in Punjab. And unfortunately, she got murdered in Kaithal. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler who was here, tells us that she got murdered by ordinary peasants for her clothes. Just imagine. Huh? And finally, her grave is not far from here. It's at Turkman Gate, behind the stock exchange. My wife and I had recently gone to visit it. It's now completely sort of cluttered with buildings. But there are two ancient graves, one of her and one of her sister. At that point of time, it was on the banks of the Yamuna. Today, it is surrounded by the stock exchange and all these buildings. So we have this fantastic woman again, who was not given her due, was not entitled to rule, was not, unfortunately, the ruler that recognized as the ruler that she was, only because she was a woman. We now move forward to the next great, and this time, this lady not only ruled, but was recognized perhaps as the greatest ruler ever of the country she ruled, Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth was born into the Tudor dynasty. Her father, Henry VIII, married 6 times. And his wives went something like this: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, died. The first was Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, who combined Aragon and Castile and started ruling Spain in 1492. He was happy with her. Unfortunately, he thought that since she was married to his elder brother, who died at the age of 15, he was cursed. And he brought out a verse from Leviticus in the Bible which says that no man shall sleep with his brother's wife. Catherine assured him that the brother had not consummated the wedding. Despite that, since only a daughter was produced and no son produced, he tried to divorce her. And at that point of time, her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was the big boss in Europe, and the Pope was actually under him. There was no question, therefore, of getting a papal dispensation. The result was that this man, who wrote Defender of the Faith and many other books defending the papacy, suddenly decided to break with the papacy only because he couldn't get a divorce from his wife. And he then made himself head of the church, divorced Catherine, married Anne Boleyn. And it's through Anne Boleyn that he produced Queen Elizabeth. Now, England had been ruled by foreigners ever since 1066. It continues to be ruled by foreigners. No Englishman has ever sat on the throne since 1066. You've had French dynasties, you had the Plantagenets after 1485. You have then had the Tudors, a Welsh dynasty. After them, you had the Stuarts, Scott dynasty, and finally the Hanoverians, who are German. What is remarkable about Elizabeth is, first, that she was brought up as a Protestant. Her mother was beheaded when she was only 2 years old. She was brought up in a court where Henry was busy fighting his wars and amassing wives, as we have already told you. And finally, when he died, fortunately for her, in his will, he made it clear that after him, his elder daughter will succeed if there is no male issue. And after Mary, If she has no male issue, in turn Elizabeth will rule. So legitimacy for her was found in Henry VIII's ultimate will. But unfortunately for her, when her sickly brother Edward VI succeeded Henry, and he ruled for about 6 years, he in his will ultimately said that only those who are descended from one particular sister of Henry VIII, that is Mary, and only her children, Francis and somebody else, and her children's children, can rule provided they have male issue. 2 days before his death, because he knew they had no male issues, he finally put in his own hand the Lady Jane Grey. So, in an England which had never been ruled by a woman, you suddenly had 3 women, one after the other. You had Jane Grey. Poor thing, she was a puppet. She ruled for about 8 days, after which she was taken down and Queen Mary declared, because Mary was the elder daughter, if you remember, from Catherine of Aragon. Mary ruled for 5 years and upset everything because she was Catholic. So you had a huge pogrom against Protestants. And one of the people who was burned at the stake was Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who, poor fellow, put his hand into the fire first and said, "It is with this that I signed my death warrant and that I gave up my religion. Let this burn first." She ruled very badly, having married Philip II of Spain. They both ruled from their respective countries. And fortunately for England, died in 1558. Elizabeth then took over, and Elizabeth, being Protestant, was widely welcomed. Now, this lady, again, like Cleopatra, was a genius. She spoke about 4 languages, as a matter of fact. She founded Dublin University. She founded some 100 grammar schools, which were free for little children. And she's supposed to have, at Trinity College in Dublin, replied to a full speech in her honor, given in Greek. She was remarkable for her age for many things. In fact, it was called the Elizabethan age as a result, because the arts flourished as well. Shakespeare, Marlowe, the great Francis Bacon, all these were persons who were in fact greatly encouraged by her. She was she was brilliant in doing 2 things. One, in finding the right person for the right job. And second, in making procrastination a fine art. She found William Cecil, who was our Prime Minister for over 25 years and who ruled the country extremely well. What he gave England, England never had. He gave England peace. All the great English forebears, whether you think of Henry II, Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, Henry V, who regained most of France, all of them ultimately fell on their faces because finally every territory in France went back to France, with Calais alone remaining. What she achieved was a lasting peace, most important. Second, not only did she rule wisely and well, she was tolerant. She saw what happened under the reign of Queen Mary and therefore tolerated Catholics so long as they were tolerant of her. Now, the major Catholic thorn in her flesh was Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots was a cousin, being a descendant from another sister of Henry VIII, Margaret, who married James IV of Scotland. And she, as a young girl, got married off to Francis I of France. He died early. So she came back to Scotland and then got married to Henry Darnley, who was a Stuart. And that union produced James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England and succeeded her. Now, she had a very rough time ruling Scotland, as a result of which she and her third husband, Bothwell, had to flee to England. And once she fled to England, the Great William Cecil, that is the Prime Minister of Elizabeth, kept her almost captive in various castles for her 21-year stay in England. Finally, there was a popish plot, Catholic plot, by one Babington, in which she was directly implicated, as a result of which she had to be tried. She was tried, she was ordered to be sentenced to death. Elizabeth kept procrastinating, didn't want her killed, until finally, both Francis Walsingham, her Secretary of State, and William Cecil insisted and said, look, so long as this woman is alive, the Catholics won't leave you. You have to put her to death. Finally, she signed the death warrant, and in 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. The beheading also was remarkable in that she was wearing a wig which nobody knew. So when her head rolled down, the wig flew off. And what was revealed of a 44-year-old lady was short grey hair. Elizabeth was very upset with her killing, didn't quite recover. But she had other things at hand. She was best known for staving off a massive invasion that was prepared by Philip II of Spain. Philip II got together an armada of ships, of 130 ships, which set sail and sought to, therefore, invade England by coming up into the Thames River. Fortunately for Elizabeth, she had some great admirals at hand. She had Sir Francis Drake, who had circumnavigated the entire globe after Zheng He, the Chinese, in 1421, and after Magellan a century later. She also had Sir Walter Raleigh. And they mustered together 82 ships. So you had 130 against 82. The 82 set sail from Plymouth and met the Spanish Armada. Fortunately for them, the Spanish ships couldn't exactly attune their guns to the English ships, so that whatever was actually hit by cannonballs actually went over the English vessels. And not only did a favorable wind blow the Armada back, but that had happened only 10 days after battle. The English also set some 6 ships ablaze and shoved them into the Armada, so to speak, so that a lot of them were set ablaze. Finally, they managed to stave off the invasion, all 82 ships coming back, and only 54 of the 130 ships going back to Spain. One of the most fantastic speeches she ever made was at a place called Tilbury, where she exhorted her troops as well as the sailors and told them, I may be a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, nonetheless a king of England. And the troops cheered her, the navy cheered her, and they went to battle for her and succeeded. Shortly before she died, she called a parliament. She didn't get on very well with her later parliaments. They had to keep calling parliaments to levy taxes. And the tax burden was generally low in her reign. So she addressed this parliament as well in 1601, 2 years before she died. And she told that parliament that, look, there may have been mightier, better rulers than me, but none that have loved all of you so much. And truly, she was the most loved monarch of her time. She died in 1603, greatly loved, greatly mourned, and was finally set at rest beside her sister Mary in Westminster Abbey, a place that the two of us have visited. She was a remarkable woman, and Will Durant tells us that she was undoubtedly the greatest ruler of England ever. We now come to the last subject of today's talk. One other great. This time it's Catherine the Great, the ruler of Russia. This lady was born Sophie, a German princess, at a place called Anhalt-Zerbst in Germany. And she was drafted by Empress Elizabeth of Russia this time to marry the heir presumptive to the throne, Peter III. But let us go back a little in history. Who was this Peter III? He was none other than the grandson of Peter the Great. All of you have heard of Peter the Great. Now, Peter the Great was a larger-than-life figure. He was arguably the greatest of the Romanov dynasty. He was 6 foot 8 inches. And he wanted to modernize Russia overnight. He went and spent many years of his reign trying to learn how to build ships in the docks in Amsterdam, and came back and actually fitted together a whole Baltic Sea fleet. So what did he do to try and modernize Russia? Overnight, he said, everyone's beard must be removed. Many didn't remove their beards. So he decided to levy a beard tax, which was from 1 kopeck, depending on whether the person was a serf, to a couple of rubles, depending on how rich the man was. He made it a great disincentive. And not only that, you had to wear a gibbet which pronounced that you had actually paid the tax. Otherwise, you are liable to be taken in and your beard shaved off. Now, this remarkable man fought many battles, fought the great battle of Poltava in 1709 against his most formidable adversary, Charles XII of Sweden, and finally extended the entire territory of Russia in the Baltic region and actually built St. Petersburg. This great ruler died in 1725. His wife took over as Catherine I. And this grandson of his, Peter III, happened also to be a great nephew of Charles XII of Sweden. He was in fact offered the Swedish throne before he was offered the Russian throne. And once the Swedish Diet actually found that he had already been offered the Russian throne, they withdrew the offer. But anyway, Peter III happened to be a silly little chap. He was a person who thought that he was like a Prussian prince. So he would dress up like a Prussian prince. And he had toy soldiers and he'd fight toy battles. He was known to hang rats, actually passed sentence on a rat which had nibbled the toe of one of his toy soldiers and hanged the rat. Now, obviously a lady who was as brilliant as Catherine, once she was married to this character, found that she was a complete misfit. So for many years, they led their own lives. And the 7 Years' War then took place. Now the 7 Years' War began in 1756. Frederick the Great of Prussia found himself surrounded by 4 formidable allies: Austria, France, Russia under Elizabeth, and some German princes. And despite having fought the great battles of Rossbach and Leuthen, and having staved off his enemies for some time, found in 1761 that he was at the end of his tether. And short of some miracle, he would have either had to commit suicide or cede his kingdom. The miracle happened. Empress Elizabeth died of Russia. And Peter III took over. As I told you, Peter III loved Prussia, loved everything Prussian. So it's perhaps the only case in history where an entire army fighting on one side now suddenly switches and fights on the other side. So the entire Russian army now was switched and fought on Peter the on the side of Frederick the Great. This intolerable state of affairs couldn't continue. He also wanted to invade Denmark. He had some crazy scheme. So the result was that his reign lasted about 6 months. And in a palace coup, Catherine, who was now invested, she was now called Catherine because she was in fact, she became part of the Russian Orthodox Church and gave up her Lutheran background. She was now called Catherine. Now took over. Peter, of course, got murdered. Another rival also got murdered. And Catherine started ruling in 1762. She had a fantastic 34-year reign. She did many things. First, the territory of Russia was expanded by some 200,000 miles. Second, the entire Crimean region was annexed. Through Potemkin, one of her lovers, she founded Sebastopol. Voltaire, in fact, called her the Semiramis of the North. Semiramis was some ancient Assyrian queen, 8th century BC, who was known for profligacy. She's supposed to have had some 21 lovers in 40 years. But apart from that, each lover was a remarkable man who, in turn, gave his life for her. The Orlov brothers, for example. Potemkin, who himself founded the Black Sea Fleet and annexed Crimea. And people like Poniatowski, who then ultimately became ruler or king of Poland. She also, like Elizabeth of England, encouraged the arts. She corresponded with Voltaire. She actually had a great French poet, Diderot, visit her. And Diderot was a very excitable chap. So apparently, every time they engaged in conversation, he would slap her thighs. And she said that every time this man would come, I would go back with red thighs. But didn't mind it because he was so brilliant. She was also soft-hearted in her own way. She would keep bread out for birds. But unfortunately for her, she didn't get on with her own son. Paul, who succeeded her, was taken away from her almost at birth by the Empress Elizabeth and brought up separately. So what she did was to make friends with her grandchildren. And her grandson, Alexander, who became Alexander I, after the brief rule of his father, was the one who finally defeated Napoleon with the help of the Russian winter in 1812. This great woman was again considered by many to be the greatest ever ruler that Russia had, even though Peter the Great was a strong contender. So at the end we find that of these historical personages, the first three who existed way back in time, each had to fight with their backs to the wall. Each of them were brilliant, but none of them succeeded. It's only the two fairly recent ones in history who succeeded, Elizabeth and finally Catherine the Great. We now fast forward into the 20th century. The 1960s brought a rich haul of women prime ministers. For the first time, you had Bandaranaike in Ceylon. You had Indira here. You also had Golda Meir in Israel. In 1979, you had Margaret Thatcher. After which I have counted, there's something like 125 women heads of state, whether president or prime minister, since then. In India, we have had a woman president. But unfortunately, despite the fact that we've had a woman president and we've had a woman prime minister, we have never had a woman chief justice. I see the picture of Sunanda today. It's a beautiful picture and I remember her this way. She was probably the candidate for becoming the first chief justice, woman chief justice of India. Unfortunately, life was cruel to her and cut her remarkable career short. In any event, I hope that given the present dispensation, the time for the first woman chief justice won't be very far off. With that, I thank you all very much.
Maya Angelou wrote, "Just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of the tides, just like hope springing high, I will rise." I'm so grateful to Justice Nariman for enlightening us about so many women who have done just that. who have not given up in the face of adversity, and who have paved the way for me and for generations that are yet to come. I'm fortunate to say that my grandmother was one such woman. She continued to sit as a judge for over a year after receiving her terminal cancer diagnosis. I would also like to thank Justice Lokur and the other trustees, as well as Justice Rama Subramaniam, for their unwavering support, and members of the audience for taking the time to attend the lecture in spite of growing concerns and insecurity caused by the pandemic. I am thankful to our media partners, Live Law and Bar and Bench, for helping us to promote and stream the lecture in a manner that is safe and accessible to all. Finally, I would like to share with everyone that this lecture is a labor of love. Love for my grandmother by my grandfather, Murli Bhandare, who at the age of 92 insisted that we hold the lecture and made every effort to familiarize himself with new technology to ensure that it's held online and that Justice Nariman's wealth of knowledge could be witnessed by so many of us from the comfort of our home. Thank you so much.